Hello, Year 10. Welcome to your third Macbeth lesson of the week. It's Mr. Blower here with you again, and today we'll be going through Act 1, Scene 3. As it says at the top of the screen, you are going to need a copy of Act 1, Scene 3, which is attached on Show My Homework, along with the Act 1, Scene 3 bingo grid, and the purpose and use of that will become clear later on. Before we get on with Scene 3, just want to look back briefly at what we learned on Tuesday about Act 1, Scene 2. Now, we were given the impression, very strongly, that Macbeth is a hero, that he has almost superhuman powers on the battlefield. And that impression came from the report that was written by the captain or the sergeant, who pretty much told King Duncan that Macbeth was man of the match on the battlefield. As a result, Duncan has put Macbeth up on this metaphorical pedestal. Now, as we know from recent issues, when you put undeserving people up on pedestals, that can have serious consequences. So we might wonder whether Duncan was wise to do that. Meanwhile, Banquo has kind of been relegated to the role of sidekick. So he's the kind of Robin to Macbeth's Batman. And we're yet to know how he will feel about playing that role in the play, because we haven't met Macbeth or Banquo in person yet. What we may have seen beneath the surface in Act 1, Scene 2 is that Macbeth is dangerous. And he's dangerous to Duncan. So as a hero, we get the impression that or Duncan gets the impression that he's trying to protect and defend Scotland, but his brutal and savage ways actually foreshadow the way that things are going to turn out later on in the play. Duncan is the blind mouse. Rather than being the wise king, he can't really see what's straight in front of him. And as a result of that, we wonder straight away, really, whether that naivety, that kind of gullibility and willingness to trust other people is going to cause his downfall and lead to the toppling of his crown. So that was Act 1, Scene 2. Now cracking on with Act 1, Scene 3. As always, we've got a do now task. A couple of questions there that are going to be based on that image. So first question, based on what you already know about the play, which of these two men is Macbeth and which is Banquo? Try and explain. And then number 2, what else might this illustration suggest about the play in terms of themes, plot, setting and characters? There's a challenge question there as well that might help you or encourages you to relate the image and these sort of particular issues to context. So pause the video, spend a couple of minutes just having a go at those questions. So I expect most of you have concluded that this would be Macbeth, because from what you know of the plot from your summary work that you did last week, we know that Macbeth ends up kind of in communication or interacting with the witches. So his kind of movement towards them, his proximity, his close proximity to them, suggests that this could be Macbeth. Whereas this character who's kind of stepping backwards and reaching for his sword seems to be the more cautious Banquo. Now, as we'll see in more detail as we explore Act 1, Scene 3 today, this scene kind of presents a fork in the road for Macbeth and Banquo. Up to this point, they've been travelling on the same path. Remember, they are co-generals in the Scottish army. But with the arrival of the witches, we get this divergence of that path. They're offered two different routes. Now, that could be a literal thing, in that Macbeth is kind of going to carve out his passage, to use a quote from Act 1, Scene 2, towards becoming king. And that will kind of take him out on his own on the dark side. So it's going to kind of take him off towards hell. The right side could potentially be the right path, as in the correct path to take. So we've got, like I said, this fork in the road. The witches have presented this kind of dilemma or this decision to Macbeth and to Banquo, and we kind of get the impression that Macbeth is going to choose the morally wrong path, whereas Banquo is going to choose the morally right path, which would be to defend his country and his king, to be loyal. Okay, so in today's lesson, as with our other lessons, we've got kind of one central question that underpins the lesson. And today that is, once they appear on stage, what are our first impressions of Macbeth and Banquo, and how do they interact with the witches? Now, this is a slightly different question to the other day, because the first impressions we gained of Macbeth and Banquo in Act 1, Scene 2 were as a result of what we were told about them. Okay, we haven't yet seen them on stage, so this is different in that sense. So we will read and watch parts of the scene, use a bingo grid to select quotes and explore language independently. We'll then look at the scene together and go through that bingo grid to just check that we've selected details and analyse some of those features. And then we're going to finish by just comparing Macbeth and Banquo, focusing on their reaction to the witches. Okay, the images down at the bottom might help us to understand the characters and aspects of their relationship, and also solve the mystery of what happened to Mr. Hof a couple of years ago, because he appears to have retrained as a classical actor. Strange world. Okay, before we get onto the language, let's think about the setting. If you remember back in Act 1, Scene 1, the witches asked the question, where the place? And the place that they say they're going to meet Macbeth, if you remember, was... Yep, that's correct, the heath. Now, for those of you who've never been lucky or unfortunate enough, depending on your perspective, to visit Heathland, this is what it looks like. This is what it can look like. So we know that Macbeth was due to meet the witches upon the heath. And we might just pause the video for a second and think about that question bottom right. Why do you think they might choose this location for their meeting? Why do you think the witches have chosen these kind of heath-like settings to meet Macbeth? Pause the video, jot down some ideas. Okay, hopefully you've had some thoughts about why a heath. My basic ideas on that would be that it's exposed. It's open to the elements, so therefore whoever is there is going to be vulnerable to thunder, lightning and rain, as was mentioned in the stage directions in Act 1, Scene 1, when that creepy mood and atmosphere was being established. It also would suggest that Macbeth, or any man really, would be outside of their comfort zone. Now, if you think that noblemen like Macbeth, successful people, would have lived in castles with thick walls, moats, turrets, and drawbridges to keep people away if they didn't want them there, they were very much used to the security of the man-made world. So here they're out in the middle of nowhere, and therefore this might be the domain of the supernatural, certainly the more wild elements of nature, and therefore they are vulnerable. Okay, so we're now going to watch a stage adaptation of Act 1, Scene 3. This is an abridged version, which just means a shortened version of the entire scene. If you'd like to watch the whole scene, you can use the address down bottom right here, and that's about 7 or 8 minutes long and features Ian McKellen, who you probably better know as Gandalf, playing Macbeth. And that's a really good one to look at if you want to see, as I said, the scene in its entirety, and crucially the use of the dramatic technique called the aside, A-S-I-D-E. Okay, Ian McKellen does that particularly well in that particular version. But we're going to focus on this just under 3-minute version. So have a watch, think about what you make of the witches and the way that they're presented and the way that Banquo and Macbeth react to the witches.
So foul and fair a day I have not seen. Our first call to forest.
Now we are sisters, hand in hand, hostess of the sea and land. Thus to go about, thrice to die and twice to mine, and twice again to make up nine.
What?
Peace! The charms wound up.
What are these? They look not like the inhabitants of the earth, and yet are aught. Live you, or are you aught that men may question? Speak, if you can. What are you?
All hail, Macbeth. Hail to thee, same of glance. All hail, Macbeth. Hail to thee, same of cordial. All hail, Macbeth, that shalt be king hereafter.
Good sir, why do you start and seem to fear things that do sound so fair? In the name of truth, Are you fantastical, or that indeed which outwardly you show? My noble partner, you greet with present grace and great prediction of noble having and of royal hope, that he seems rapt withal. To me you speak not. If you can, look into the seed of time and say which grain will grow and which will not. Speak then to me. Neither beg nor fear your favours nor your hate.
Hail, hail, hail. Lesser than Macbeth, and greater. Not so happy, yet much happier. Thou shalt get kings, though thou be none. So all hail Macbeth, and Banquo and Macbeth. All hail.
Stay, you imperfect speakers, tell me more. I know I am Thane of Glass, but how of Cawdor? The Thane of Cawdor lives, a prosperous gentleman, and to be king stands not within the prospect of belief. No more than to be Cawdor. Say from whence you owe this strange intelligence, and why, upon this blasted heath, you stop our way with such prophetic greeting. Speak, I charge you.
Okay, so you might be wondering why the director of this production has chosen to take 3 demonic Year 7s and turn the play into the world's weirdest sleepover. But it's actually, in my mind, quite an interesting metaphor for how the witches like to cause chaos in the adult world. And that's illustrated by these 3 terrifying tweens. Right, before we start looking at the scene in a more analytical fashion, we've got some more subject terminology today. So you can either find the grid that you added to on Monday, or you can create a new one. And we're just looking at 4 terms today. Again, these are terms that you would expect students to be using in the kind of grade 7, 8 and 9 sort of category. But they're ones that I'm sure, with a bit of concentration, a bit of effort, many of you could use irrespective of your target grades. So we've got juxtaposition, dramatic foil, antithesis, and aside, a word I mentioned already today. If you know the terms, try to use them when we're analysing independently, but just take a minute now to pause the video and put them in the appropriate column. Okay, for the next part of the lesson, you're going to need the bingo sheet that I mentioned earlier, which looks like this. You're also going to need a copy of Act 1, Scene 3, so you might want a paper copy of this on your desk with Act 1, Scene 3 in front of you on the computer screen, or vice versa. I would suggest for this activity that you also grab yourself your favourite treat. I'm going to go for hobnobs. Get yourself a little pile of hobnobs or Haribos or whatever other biscuit of choice that you prefer. And we'll use those as a reward so that every time you complete a row or a column, you just stop, give yourself a pat on the back and have a snack. If I just explain to you how these bingo grids work. So in each box, you'll have a prompt or a question. So here, a symbol of the battle that is about to begin. Battle is in inverted commas because it doesn't mean battle as in a physical battle like a war. It means a metaphorical battle, so a conflict between 2 groups of people. So we're going to look for evidence from Act 1, Scene 3 that shows a symbol of the battle about to begin. And then there's a follow-up question, which is who holds the power at this point and why? So this just gives you an opportunity to explore your thinking a little bit more and take quotes and turn them into analysis, which is obviously a key exam skill. Now, what you'll find is that the grid works through the scene chronologically. So these ones will be from the first sort of 15, 20 lines of the scene. And then as we work our way down the grid, you should be working your way through the extract. Now, to do this properly, I think it should take at least 15 or 20 minutes. So if you pause the video, have a go at that, and then afterwards we will go through Act 1, Scene 3 and make sure that you've got something written in each of these boxes if you struggled with it independently. Okay, pause the video, have a go. Okay, welcome back. Hopefully you have a full bingo grid and a full belly. If the bingo grid is still looking a little bit patchy, we will now go through the scene together so that you can fill in any blanks that you have. And you can also make additional notes on your copy of Act 1, Scene 3 or in your book based on what I'm about to talk you through. So let's start at the start. We've got the stage direction, drum within, and the third witch says, a drum, Macbeth doth come. And we can use this to complete the first box on the bingo grid. So the symbol of the battle that is about to begin is this drum beat. We might think that a drum beat is something that would accompany two armies into battle. It could also, if we think about an alternative interpretation, be an accompaniment to an upcoming execution. So you might get a drum roll before someone was executed. So we've got that sense of foreboding and sense of foreshadowing in that the drum beat could represent the fact that the witches coinciding and meeting Macbeth actually eventually will lead to Macbeth's death and his beheading. So we've kind of got that suggestion in there. A third alternative could be that the drum is like the heartbeat. We've said before that the witches are excited and excitable about what they're up to. And we've got that exclamatory language there. So the drum beating could be a metaphor for their heartbeats racing as they meet Macbeth. If you think about the question, who holds the power at this point? Well, that seems to me to be fairly obvious in that it's the witches, because they're the ones who knew they were going to meet Macbeth. They've planned this all along, and Macbeth and Banquo have kind of just unwittingly wandered into their trap. Okay, we now get the entrance of Macbeth and Banquo. Remember, Macbeth is still leading, so on stage, the actor playing Macbeth may well walk in front of the actor playing Banquo. And Macbeth speaks first, again, emphasising his status, saying, so foul and fair a day I have not seen. And obviously, we're thinking back to Monday's lesson there, and we're thinking that those words establish an immediate connection between Macbeth and the witches, because they echo the words that were spoken by the witches in their opening speech. In terms of what's interesting about that connection, well, like I said, from early in the play, we've got an association between a nobleman, a man who's supposed to be on the side of the king, an employee of the king, and he's being connected with the supernatural that would be potentially a threat to the king. So you've got a strange combination there, a combination that you wouldn't expect and you wouldn't find in many of Shakespeare's plays. Now that might worry the onlooking King James I, who would think, why would someone who is supposed to be loyal and patriotic and one of my leaders, why would he have anything to do with these witches? And like I said, that would unsettle him. If you want to be a real geek about this, we might think about something called syntax, which is word order here, because the syntax here is interesting, or I think it's interesting anyway, because he says so foul and fair. And we notice that foul is the first word, so foul, and it comes before fair. So he initially, straight away, he thinks something's up, something's bad. But then within 2 words, he's changed that to fair. So it looks strange. This situation doesn't look like one that I'm comfortable with, but I'm quite quickly warming up to the idea that it could actually be okay. And just in those few words, we kind of get a symbol of the way that Macbeth is going to react in this scene, and then increasingly throughout the play. In that for a moment, he seems to doubt what he sees, then he quickly kind of accepts the presence of the witches and actually desires it. Okay, so after the paradoxical language that might show Macbeth's confusion at what he's just come across, we get Banquo's much longer speech. And Banquo says, how far is it called to Forres? What are these so withered and so wild in their attire that look not like the inhabitants of the earth, and yet are on it? Live you, or are you aught that man may question? You seem to understand me, by each at once her chappy finger laying upon her skinny lips. You should be women, and yet your beards forbid me to interpret that you are so. So we might be using this speech to fill in some of this box here, 2 lines or phrases that show us Banquo's view of the witches or the supernatural. So this line particularly, we might use the word these. He seems to sort of speak about them or to them as if they're creatures and not humans. He also refers to them as withered and wild, which at once could suggest that they're weak, withered, they don't seem to pose a threat, but also that they're wild and maybe savage and they do pose a threat. So we're really in a bit of a quandary here. We're really wondering whether these women are pathetic and easy to ignore, or whether they're actually quite sinister and threatening. And he then says that they look not like the inhabitants of the earth. In other words, they're almost like aliens, like foreigners. So he seems to be very skeptical, very dubious about the presence of these women. And that will, as we will see later on, put him in juxtaposition or in contrast with Macbeth, who has a rather different reaction. So basically, if we think about his attitude or his view towards the witches, he doesn't think they're real. He doesn't think they're genuine. That continues when he says, "You should be women, and yet your beards forbid me to interpret that you are so." So again, he's just very skeptical, very dubious about these women, what they are, whether they exist at all, or whether he might be actually seeing something. If you remember from Mrs. Malt's lessons a couple of weeks ago, the idea of post-traumatic stress disorder, well, both Banquo and Macbeth have just spent a long time on the battlefield fighting in a bloody conflict. So they could be suffering trauma, and part of that trauma could be to hallucinate. So he may be questioning whether what's in front of him is real at all, or whether it's just a mirage, a product of his imagination, his traumatized imagination. And if we think about the tone of his language there, again, like we said, it's doubtful, it's skeptical, it's quizzical. We've got those repeated questions. Then we get Macbeth down at the bottom, who says two things. One is a command, speak if you can, and then follows that up with a question, what are you? So by saying speak if you can, he's obviously saying, he's telling them to do something. He thinks maybe he is stronger than them, he can control or command them. But when he says, what are you? He shows that he's intrigued. And we might be thinking about this fourth box. The audience can tell that Macbeth is interested in the witches when he says, well, this would be one of the quotes I'd expect you to have written down. In terms of, at this point, how an actor playing Macbeth might move on stage, this is a stagecraft point. There's no harm in mentioning in essays to show that really kind of evaluative understanding of the play. We'd expect, like in the picture earlier, Macbeth would step towards the witches, whereas Banquo would step away from them. And that just demonstrates their attitude towards them. On the stagecraft front, and this is more kind of theatrical geekery, you may or may not know at the time that women weren't allowed to be on stage for plays. They weren't allowed to act. So the male roles would have been, the female roles would have been played by women. So the three witches, you would have had men, potentially older men with beards, stood on stage. So it would be a very confusing image, this, for the audience, as well as for the actors, for the characters. Okay, on to this next bit. We get the witches then speaking one after another. All hail Macbeth, hail to thee, Thane of Glamis. All hail Macbeth, hail to thee, Thane of Cawdor. All hail Macbeth, thou shalt be king hereafter. Okay, so that's the obvious answer to the question in this particular box from the bingo grid, is that we know he knows he's Thane of Glamis. They're telling him he's about to become Thane of Cawdor, which he doesn't know yet. Remember, at this stage, he still doesn't know that he's going to be Thane of Cawdor, although Duncan's made that decision in the previous scene. And we then get this kind of shocking prediction from the third witch that Macbeth is going to be King of Scotland hereafter. Now, that might be shocking because in order to become king, something pretty drastic, dramatic, and unnatural is going to happen. He's going to have to remove the current king. And possibly the only way he's going to be able to do that is by killing him, by committing regicide. So that would completely shock a Jacobean audience. If we look at the language up here, this word hail can mean two things. It can mean to call, to get someone's attention. So you can hail a taxi, call it to come over and pick you up. Or you can hail someone as you can praise them. Okay, so you might hail the best player in your team, or you might hail a particular king or queen. So they're using language here that both gets his attention and kind of offers him praise. They're starting to flatter Macbeth. Now, the witches are incredibly persuasive, and we'll find that with the female characters in Macbeth, in that the witches and Lady Macbeth have these real powers of persuasion. We see that in their language. Again, they're excited. They're kind of calling out using this exclamatory language. So we know that Macbeth's Thane of Glamis, and he might be thinking, okay, how do these women know that I'm Thane of Glamis? I've never met them before. So that's strange. When he finds out he's going to be Thane of Cawdor, he's like, ooh, okay, that's definitely weird, because as far as I'm aware, Thane of Cawdor's alive and well. And then the idea that he will be king just comes, as I said, as a complete shock. We'll notice at this point as well that poor old Banquo is being ignored. Everything's being addressed to Macbeth. And Banquo maybe is speaking more at this stage to kind of indicate that he wants some attention, and also to express his doubts, as we've said previously. And he carries on here. Good sir, why do you start and seem to fear things that do sound so fair? In the name of truth, are ye fantastical, or that indeed which outwardly ye show? My noble partner you greet with present grace and great prediction of noble having and of royal hope, that he seems rapt withal. To me you speak not. If you can look into the seeds of time and say which grain will grow and which will not, speak then to me, who neither beg nor fear your favours, nor your hate. Now, there's a lot in that speech that you could explore, but we'll just focus on a couple of things that you might use to fill in this box, which is asking you to identify Banquo's jealousy. So when he says, are ye fantastical, he's basically saying, are you real? So that's more evidence that he doubts them. He calls Macbeth his noble partner. We know that Macbeth and Banquo are a team at this point. They're indivisible. And Banquo still respects Macbeth. And we'll find out in this scene that he actually respects him to the extent that he will try and protect him from these witches, which is why he's kind of intervening and speaking more than Macbeth, because he wants to make sure that he's in control of the situation. He says that Macbeth seems rapt withal. So Macbeth, by this point, might also not be talking because he seems to be hypnotised by what the witches have said. We can imagine an actor on stage playing Macbeth, standing there dumbstruck in a trance whilst Banquo talks. And this idea that Macbeth seems rapt emphasises that idea that Macbeth seems entranced, he seems captivated, or he seems under the spell of the witches. Now we get some stuff that we can use to fill into this box. He says, to me, you speak not. So he's maybe a bit envious there of the attention Macbeth's getting. And he then commands them at the end, speak to me, because I neither beg, I'm not desperate, nor fear, I'm not cowardly. So he's saying, I've got qualities too. What are you going to offer me? So although he's doubtful, he still is a little bit curious and a little bit jealous about what the witches might be able to offer. So he's not completely dismissing them. Okay, he's not perfect. But in contrast to Macbeth, he's certainly, as we've said about 150 times now, more doubtful. And the witches just seem to almost ignore him. They don't engage with him, because if they engage with him, then they've got to answer his questions, and they can't really answer his questions, not without giving the game away. So they just say, hail, hail, hail. So the witches then continue with these kind of what sound like riddles. And we might be using this evidence here to fill in the predictions for Banquo. So lesser than Macbeth and greater, not so happy, yet much happier. Thou shalt get kings, though thou be none. So all hail Macbeth and Banquo. And the first witch then interestingly says, and this is another syntax point, another point about the word order, Banquo and Macbeth all hail. So Banquo for the first time comes first. So that's maybe to try and placate him, to appease him, to make him feel a bit better, a bit more wanted. Now, if we try and explain why these prophecies might put Banquo in a position of strength or weakness, we need to understand what they're actually saying. So they're saying that in the short term, immediately, Banquo's status is going to be lesser than Macbeth's, but it's also going to be greater in a way. So we might be thinking about what kind of status they mean. Do they mean kind of physical status like strength, or do they mean symbolic status like having a crown, having a title? But then if Banquo is going to be greater, we wonder how. And we might think, well, actually morally and intellectually, so intelligence-wise, he's going to be greater than Macbeth, which is why he's asking all these questions. He's not as gullible as Macbeth, not as easily convinced. The second witch says, not so happy, yet much happier. So again, in the short term, we don't expect Banquo to be happy. And we actually know, in terms of a bit of foreshadowing, that Banquo is going to be killed relatively soon. So he's certainly not going to be happy in the short term. But in his kind of from his perch up in heaven, he will look down later in the play and still, even when the play ends, see the prospect of his son Banquo, not Banquo, he's called Banquo, his son Fleance becoming king, because that's one of the predictions that the witches make. So when they say that Banquo is going to be much happier, that again means in the longer term. And he's also not going to suffer from the guilt and the kind of mental torment that Macbeth is going to suffer from later in the play because of all the terrible things he does. Okay, the third witch says, "Thou shalt get kings, though thou be none, so all hail Macbeth and Banquo." Now this bit's crucial, and this is what I'm talking about with Fleance. Thou shalt get kings. That means that Banquo's son, Fleance, will become king. But he himself, Banquo himself, won't become king. And again, that sounds like, oh, well, I kind of want to be king. Why don't I get it? But what it actually means is that he's kind of relieved of the burden of the crown. And what I mean by that is we see over the course of the play, once Macbeth becomes king, things start to go downhill rapidly. He goes mad, he does more violent and horrendous things. His wife dies, and then he at the end is executed and his head stuck on a stick. So the crown actually weighs heavily and makes him mad. Whereas Banquo doesn't have to wear the crown and is therefore potentially greater, happier, and more relieved. Okay, so we've said he's going to be lesser but greater, he's going to be much happier, and he's going to get kings but not be one himself. Now, on a brief context point, King James would like what he's seeing here, and the reason for that is that Banquo was actually an ancestor of King James. You can go and look up more about that in your own time. But Banquo was a distant relative of King James. So to have Banquo being presented as A, the more intelligent one, B, the one who is much more cautious about the supernatural and sees the supernatural as much more of a threat and kind of wants to get rid of them, and C, seeing Banquo as the one who ultimately will get power by having his offspring become king, is all something that will please King James. Okay, so Macbeth responds now, and he says, "Stay, you imperfect speakers, tell me more. By Sinel's death I know I am Thane of Glamis, but how of Cawdor? The Thane of Cawdor lives, a prosperous gentleman, and to be king stands not within the prospect of belief, no more than to be Cawdor. Say from whence you owe this strange intelligence, or why upon this blasted heath you stop our way with such prophetic greeting. Speak, I charge you." Now you can see from my dodgy amateur acting there that at the end he seems to be becoming increasingly angry, and we'll come back to that in a sec. Before we do, though, we might want to use some evidence from here to fill in this box, at least two quotes that reveal Macbeth's increasing intrigue and curiosity. Well, I'd be using this first line here. It's one of those lines that most GCSE students will learn off by heart and use in an exam. "Stay, you imperfect speakers, tell me more." So he's commanding them to stay. He's trying to be the authority in the situation, even though we all know that the witches are in complete control. He realizes that they're not perfect. He calls them imperfect speakers. So he is aware that something strange is going on at this stage, but he still says, "Tell me more." Now here he shows his ignorance, okay, his naivety. Thane of Cawdor doesn't live, and he's not a prosperous gentleman because he's dead. And when Macbeth says to be king stands not within the prospect of belief, that's another thing that shows that he's curious, because he uses this word prospect. He doesn't say being a king is, it's just no, it's impossible. He says it's not likely, okay? It's not within the likelihood of belief, but I'm not ruling out altogether. Now, if we were to think about his tone at this stage, we would think of him being, as we've said, in an intrigued tone, a curious tone. But then the tone changes at the end of this extract because he talks about a blasted heath, and he says, "Speak, I charge you." He becomes impatient. Now, again, that could be linked to the trauma that he's experienced on the battlefield. He's exhausted and he's just fed up with having his way home blocked by these three witches. But he could also be impatiently wanting to know how they know what they know, when or if he's going to get what he seems to have been promised. So it almost seems to have disrupted his balance, his state of mind straight away. The witches have had this immediate disruptive or corrupting influence on him, and that's made him mad. Here I mean mad in terms of angry, but over the course of the play it makes him mad in terms of insane. And then the witches, playing the games as they do, just use that opportunity to vanish. And we might think there, well, who's in charge? Well, the witches are in charge, because Macbeth says, speak, tell me more, and they just clear off. Okay, in this section, we'll just look at a couple of things. I'm quite interested in this image of the earth having bubbles. Banquo says, the earth hath bubbles as the water has, and these are of them. Whither are they vanished? Now that line, this is completely open to interpretation, but as I've said, that's one of the lovely things about English. You can use your imagination and come up with original ideas. Kind of makes me think of a cauldron. And the cauldron's the shape, roughly, of the earth. Apologies to any flat earth society people out there. But we might think if the earth, metaphorically, is the cauldron, then the witches have the ability to stir the contents and cause as much chaos on earth as they want. So Macbeth's maybe making the point, Shakespeare's making the point here that the supernatural is in control of the natural world, which is again something that's going to freak out the Jacobean audience stood and sat watching the play. Macbeth says here, would they had stayed? Okay, he's like a sort of a teenage guy wishing that his girlfriend or boyfriend had hung around for a bit longer. Oh, would they had stayed? I wish they'd hung around longer. I really wanted to spend some more time with them. So he's almost a little bit desperate there. And then we've got this box that was from the bingo grid. What are your thoughts about Banquo's lines, particularly the bits in bold? Were such things here as we do speak about? So he uses the word things to talk about the witches. He's again thinking about them being creatures and not humans. He's dismissing them as being unnatural. And again, that could be the kind of trauma, the post-traumatic stress disorder. Am I sort of, in my head right? Am I sort of seeing things, or is this accurate? And then he says, or have we eaten on the insane root that takes the reason prisoner? So again, that could be a reference to post-traumatic stress disorder. It could be the idea that the insane root, if they're going to eat it, then it has provided some sort of food. So even to take a bite out of this suggestion that witches are real, and even to take a bite out of this suggestion that Macbeth could be Thane of Cawdor and later king, is to go mad, to have your reason, your logic, your sense taken prisoner. And the word prisoner is interesting because it suggests that the witches are the ones imprisoning Macbeth and Banquo, primarily though imprisoning Macbeth. So Banquo here is still asking lots of questions. He's trying to see sense, whereas Macbeth seems to have lost his sense a little bit in that he wishes they'd stayed for longer. He's frustrated that they've gone. Okay, they then seem to kind of exchange or repeat the things they've been offered. Your children shall be kings. You shall be king. We'd wonder if the tone would be different there. Macbeth is like awestruck, amazed. Your children shall be kings. Wow. But possibly also that could be the very, very early sign of him being a bit paranoid, because he remembers just been promised that he could be king. But if Banquo's children will be kings, that means at some point Macbeth's going to lose the crown. So we could see a very early sign here of his paranoia, him starting to worry about losing the crown before he's even got it. And Banquo says, you shall be king, which he kind of thinks is ridiculous, and it might be said in a sort of incredulous tone. And Macbeth responds by saying, and Thane of Cawdor too, went it not so. So we get a sense of Macbeth's ego here and that he's been tempted. Okay? If you think about these two as a pair of dogs out on a walk, it's almost as if they've seen some sort of radioactive bone under a tree. And Banquo's kind of sniffed it and gone, no way, I'm not eating that. And Macbeth's just gobbled it all up and is starting to glow in the dark. Okay, a couple more slides to go on Act 1, Scene 3. It is one of the longer scenes, but it's an important one. So, a few lines later, we've got Ross saying, the king hath happily received, Macbeth, the news of thy success. So he's basically saying Duncan has heard of Macbeth's success on the battlefield. And then he says, he bade me from him call thee Thane of Cawdor. So Ross has turned up moments after the witches have cleared off to say, Macbeth, you're going to be Thane of Cawdor. And straight away Ross says, in which edition hail, most worthy Thane, for it is thine. Now, as I just said, Ross has told Macbeth he's going to be Thane of Cawdor, and dramatically that's interesting because it's happened right after the witches have told him, so it makes the whole thing seem much more real. And for it is thine, I think is interesting because it kind of reminds me of some biblical language, as in thine is the kingdom from the Lord's Prayer. So we're starting to get an indication there that Macbeth is almost going to become higher in status to the point where he becomes a god. And as we know at the time, if you were the king, you thought, and the people in your country thought, that you'd been appointed by God. So we kind of get a sense of Macbeth's kind of god complex maybe starting to be suggested here. And Banquo says, what can the devil speak true? So he immediately asks this kind of worried sounding question. And he uses the word devil. Now, on your bingo grid, you had this box which said Banquo's reaction to the news that Macbeth has been made Thane of Cawdor. Well, that's that quote there. What double meaning might his words have? Well, the devil speaking true is interesting because the devil could on one hand be the witches because they told Macbeth that he's going to be Thane of Cawdor moments earlier. But it could also be Macbeth himself, because if we look back a few lines in the script, one of the things that Macbeth has recently said was, and Thane of Cawdor too. So Macbeth has said, I will be Thane of Cawdor. Ross comes in and tells him he's going to be Thane of Cawdor. And Banquo then says, can the devil speak true? So we wonder whether Banquo is talking about the witches or about Macbeth or about both of them. And if he's talking about Macbeth, he quite clearly realizes here that there's a bit of a danger, that Macbeth is going to pose some problems, and he's got some work to do to save his friend from temptation. And that idea of temptation is interesting, because if we think back to the last slide, when he talked about eating from the root, I think it was eating from the poisoned root, we get that image from the Bible of the original sin, of the temptation in the Garden of Eden, of Adam and Eve and the eating of the apple. Again, if you're interested in that stuff, look it up, explore that kind of analogy in your own time. Okay, finally here, Macbeth says, the Thane of Cawdor lives. Why do you dress me in borrowed robes? So here we're sort of seeing quickly that Macbeth has got a conscience still, and he still has some doubt. He's not just completely accepting of his fate. Because he says, why do you dress me in borrowed robes? So why do you put me in someone else's clothes? Now, interestingly, that links to near the end of the play in Act 5, Scene 2, when Angus, who's yet another one of these Thanes, says of King Macbeth at that stage, now does he feel his title hang loose about him like a giant's robe upon a dwarfish thief. So by this stage, they all know that Macbeth is an imposter, okay, that he's a terrible king, that he got the title of king through the most terrible thing of committing regicide. And we know now that Macbeth is a tyrant. Okay, he rules by force. So when Angus says that his title hangs loose about him like a giant's robe, we get the idea that the kind of robes of a king, the way the costume of a king, doesn't fit Macbeth, because Macbeth is too small a man, in a metaphorical sense, to become king and to wear those clothes, to fit those clothes. And really insultingly at this stage, which shows their kind of contempt for Macbeth later in the play and their lack of fear to speak against him, Angus calls Macbeth a dwarfish thief. And we get this image of this dwarf here in robes, in clothes that are too big for him. And then finally here, Macbeth says, aside. Remember, aside means he's kind of off speaking to himself. He's not speaking to other characters. He might be speaking, if you're an actor on the stage, you might be speaking to the audience. But he says, Glamis and Thane of Cawdor. He sounds quite impressed with that, and he knows he's already got it. He says, the greatest is behind. Now, this little demo here, this little image, will illustrate what he might mean by that. So he's saying, yep, Thane of Glamis, tick. Thane of Cawdor, thank you very much. But then there's that third one of king. And he might think still at this stage, well, that's not something that's possible for me, as he kind of suggests here. But he has also said that 2 out of 3 have been achieved. So why is the third one completely impossible? If I've got 2/3 of the way there, why not maybe take that final step to achieve the third of the predictions? Okay, so at the top of this screen, this is still Macbeth speaking here, but instead of speaking aside, off stage, he's speaking to Banquo, and he says, "Do you not hope your children shall be kings, when those that gave the Thane of Cawdor to me promised no less to them?" Now, at this stage, you might be looking at the box on your bingo grid that says at least 2 quotes that reveal Macbeth's increasing intrigue and curiosity. Now, you might have already filled that in, but if you haven't, you can use a couple of things from this page. Now, he uses words like hope and promised to kind of suggest that he's hooked. Okay. Now he's asking Banquo, do you not hope that your children shall be kings? Because I think in his mind, he's thinking, I really hope that I'm going to be king. So he's kind of testing Banquo to see whether Banquo's as greedy and maybe immoral as he seems to be. And he uses this word promise to suggest this is something that he's entitled to. He's kind of like a little kid in this scene, Macbeth, in that when he's promised something, he wants it straight away. He can't wait for it or do what we call deferred gratification. He can't wait for pleasure. He has to have it quickly. And that's almost quite childish. Banquo talks about trust. And then he offers these warnings. So if you haven't yet filled in the box that says 2 lines or phrases that shows Banquo's view of the witches or the supernatural, he says here, but 'tis strange. So his language is full of caution. And oftentimes to win us to our harm, the instruments of darkness tell us truths. Win us, he uses the word win twice to kind of suggest they're in a battle or a game against the witches. And the witches seem to be winning this battle. They win us with honest trifles to betray is in deepest consequence. So when he says to betray is in deepest consequence, he's really warning Macbeth about what will happen if he's tempted towards this idea that he can be king. So he's very much sort of putting his hand up and going, no, this is not right. But by this stage, it may already be too late, because Macbeth says 2 truths are told. And again, he's speaking aside. He's not speaking to Banquo. He's keeping secrets already. As happy prologues to the swelling act of the imperial theme. Now, imperial means to do with royalty. And swelling, as in growing. So he's kind of intrigued by this idea. And he sees growth and possibility in this idea that he's going to be king. So he's very much captivated by that offer, by that promise. Okay, final slide on this kind of analysis of Act 1, Scene 3. So Macbeth is carrying on. He says, cannot be ill, cannot be good. If ill, why hath it given me earnest of success, commencing in a truth? I am Thane of Cawdor. If good, why do I yield to that suggestion, whose horrid image doth unfix my hair, and make my seated heart knock at my ribs against the use of nature? Present fears are less than horrible imaginings. My thought, whose murder yet is but fantastical, shakes so my single state of man that function is smothered in surmise, and nothing is but what is not. Now that seems really complicated, that speech, and if you're interested, you can go away and explore that in a lot more detail in your own time, because there's tons in it. Briefly though, I would say that he seems confused. Cannot be ill, cannot be good. It's more kind of paradoxical, contradictory language, so he seems full of questions. And we see that he still has a conscience or a moral compass, in that he says, why do I yield to the suggestion whose horrid image doth unfix my hair? Now the horrid image is the image or the idea of killing Duncan and therefore becoming king. We see in this picture here, Macbeth later in the play when he's got the crown, and we see from his facial expression that he's full of doubt and fear and anxiety and paranoia. So the thought of becoming king and how he's going to become king actually scares him. It makes his hair become unfixed, makes his heart knock at his ribs. So he still at this stage knows the difference between right or wrong. Although, think back to that pathway earlier, that road that splits or forks, he is still edging towards the immoral dark side. And Banquo repeats something that he said earlier. He says, look how our partner's wrapped. Look how he's transfixed. He's kind of captivated. Okay, so Macbeth is in a trance. And then aside again, because notice here, Macbeth is no longer interacting with other people. He's not speaking to Banquo or with Banquo. Remember, who was his equal. He's just speaking to himself. Okay, all of these words are aside. And he says, if chance will have me king, why, chance may crown me without my stir. So we had that question on the bingo grid, and I asked you to think about what that means, or what that suggests that he believes. Well, it seems to suggest that he believes that fate or destiny is now indicating that he will become king, because he thinks that his fate is now tied up with the witch's prophecies. He also says that it's without my stir. Now that means without me doing anything. It means he's going to not have to put in any effort. It's just going to happen, because he became Thane of Cawdor without anything happening, really. And now he thinks he's potentially going to become king. So he kind of makes himself feel a little bit more at ease, a little bit more comfortable with the idea that he's not going to have to go and do anything like kill the king himself, because the crown is just going to be handed to him. He doesn't know why, but it is just going to be handed to him. And Banquo looks across at Macbeth and, noticing that he's almost in a trance, says, new horrors come upon him. Now that's just after the bit of script that I've given you. I was looking to cut it down. When he says new horrors come upon him, Banquo seems to be suggesting that he realizes that Macbeth is now thinking about doing the unthinkable, and that is becoming king. So Banquo is very much suspicious of Macbeth at this point. So Banquo is good, Macbeth is potentially very bad. Okay, if you think back to last lesson, we thought about what makes for a hero and what makes a king. And I just want to look at a couple of really quick things here. Now, Macbeth seems to be heroic in Act 1, Scene 2 because of his actions. Okay, he's a superhero because he's a great fighter. But in this scene, we might see that both Macbeth and Banquo are defined by their actions, in that Macbeth's action is to be tempted by the witches, and that's not very heroic. And Banquo, who's down here now, his action is to step away from the witches. Now that makes Banquo, for the audience, the heroic character, and Macbeth much less heroic. And then if we think about king, which Macbeth has been told that he is going to become, okay, so actually, just to go back over here a sec, Banquo is the force for good in the play. He's the morally virtuous and selfless one. He's not doing it for himself, he's doing it for other people. So his rejection of the supernatural is for his king and for his country, not for his own personal gain. And in terms of a king, well, will Macbeth, if he kills King Duncan and becomes king, be respected? No. Will he be a force for good? No. Is he going to be generous? Well, of course not, because he's completely self-obsessed, completely egotistical. And is what he is doing intelligent and knowledgeable and wise? Well, no, because he can't see that those actions are going to lead to his downfall. Okay, nearly at the end of the lesson, we've got a question to answer, which is, once they appear on stage, what are our first impressions of Macbeth and Banquo, and how do they interact with the witches? So you've got two choices here. You can either pause the video and write an answer, which I would say you'd need about 150 words to do with quotes. And there are a few things here that you can read through to help you answer that question. You can try and use some of this language down here. If you don't want to write 150 words, which I'm sure is maybe a temptation, you could just do a Venn diagram at this point, where you answer the question through notes in this form. So Macbeth's reaction to the witches, Banquo's reaction to the witches, and then any way in which they react similarly to the witches. And you might include you should include specific quotes in this, as well as your own ideas. Okay, just before you do that, I mentioned these terms earlier, and I haven't mentioned these two, dramatic foil and the antithesis. Super quickly, a dramatic foil is a character in a play that makes the protagonist, the main character, look either better or worse. So it's a bit like a sidekick. Okay, so Banquo seems to be a foil for Macbeth, but because Banquo is so moral and so good and he does the right thing, that emphasizes Macbeth's tendency to do the wrong thing. Okay, so that's what a dramatic foil is. An antithesis just means the opposite of. Now you might think, well, actually, Banquo and Macbeth aren't the antithesis of one another because they were both sort of tempted. They're both generals, and it's only now that they're going in different directions. But as the play develops, the way they behave seems to be the antithesis of one another. Okay, so pause the video, give yourself some time to answer the question. Right, welcome back. 2 quick learning review things to do. Take the terms, move them on the grid if you now have a more confident understanding of them. So pause the video and do that. And then finally, you could write a summary of the scene if that's helpful for you in this kind of formula form. And then on your copy of Act 1, Scene 3, if you've managed to print it out, you've got these summary boxes, which might just be quite a helpful revision activity. Once you've done all that, you're done. Thanks for working hard again. I hope you found these lessons interesting and useful. And if you've got any ideas on what you've read that I haven't discussed or mentioned, please feel free to send me an email with questions or ideas, and I'll respond. Okay, have a good day. Cheers, Year 10.